My dear friend and science writer Connie Barlow has written, "Tell me a creation story more wondrous than that of a living cell forged from the residue of exploding stars. Tell me a creation more magical than that of a fish hauling out on the land and becoming amphibious, or that of a reptile taking to the air and becoming bird, or a mammal looking back to the sea and becoming whale. Surely this science-based culture can find meaning and cause for celebration in its very own cosmic creation story." Connie and her husband, Michael Dowd, travel all over North America trying to help people see that even though we have so many glorious creation stories that come out of various religions and cultures all over the world, you and I are the very first generation to know about the actual creation story that is based in scientific facts. It's only since we've had the Hubble telescope, which is in most of our lifetimes, that people understand that the stars are born and the stars die. And in fact, we can now watch as stars are born and stars die. It's incredible when you contemplate it that in the most of our lifetimes, people have just now started to understand the origins of the chemical elements in the periodic table. For generations, we knew the elements. We even knew how to work with the elements, but we had no unified or provable understanding of where all these elements came from. Now we know that they came from the death of stars that existed before the birth of our sun. We now know that Crosby, Stills, and Nash are right, that we are stardust. Everything is made up from stars that have died. We are the first people on earth to actually know this. This is an incredible moment in time and human understanding, and it's a moment for a shift in religious understanding and consciousness about what's real and what's true. Every bit of carbon that is in us and around us started in a star. Iron that runs through our blood and makes it run red was once inside the belly of a giant star. Your breakfast was made of stardust. These chancel flowers are stardust reformed. The creation story of science is as glorious and miraculous and as beautiful as any religious mythological story. One of the beauties of the scientific story is that it's truly universal. It has the potential to unify the human family and help us see our true kinship with one another. Most of us know in varying degrees, with varying levels of knowledge and education, the natural creation story. But what about the scientific or evolutionary version of the Easter story? The Christian Easter story says that out of death comes new life. Well, that's what science says too. Out of the death of stars. The spiritual wisdom of the East talks of everyone and everything that dies is reincarnated. Well, that's scientifically true too, so to speak. The point is that death is generative in both science and spirituality. Out of death comes new life, rebirth, renewal. That's as scientific as it comes. In fact, in a spiritual sense, death is not to be feared but appreciated. So it is in a scientific sense. If it weren't for death, we wouldn't be here. In religion, death is the key to the fullness of life. So it is with science. Stars die and we get oxygen and plants and life. Plants and seeds die and we get new life. In other words, death is the doorway to new life. And in the human sense, we each experience many small deaths while we are still alive. Deaths of relationships, disappointments, dashed hopes, and dreams. There are many small deaths within the course of everyone's lifetimes, and how we deal with these small deaths has a direct correlation to how we deal with our final death at the end of our lives. Just this Friday night at our Soulful Sundown service, All Souls member John Jacobs told the very touching and emotional story of the death of his first wife, Joyce. He described a conversation that he had with a hospice nurse who was helping him to try to understand why Joyce was so strong and so patient and so thoughtful during the final weeks of her life. The nurse said, "It's not surprising. I see it all the time. People die how they live." In other words, how we respond to the smaller deaths that we experience while we are still alive is inextricably tied to the way that we confront our own death someday. And as I said before, in the East, there's this idea of reincarnation. It's often understood in a literal way to describe what happens after we physically die. It's usually described that we take a new form or a new body. We sometimes hear people say who think this way, that they want to be reincarnated as someone like Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie in their next life. Or they talk about hoping that their boss is reincarnated as a fungus. The second one is much more likely to occur from a scientific point of view. But the Hindu teacher Ram Dass gave a different explanation of reincarnation in the later years of his life that fits this idea that we have many deaths and rebirths in this life. Some years ago now, Ram Dass experienced a stroke and he lost the ability to move one half of his body. He was paralyzed on one side. And after that happened, he wrote an article that was aptly titled, "The Sound of One Hand Clapping." In it, he explained how he had lived many incarnations in his life. He described his childhood in a Jewish American family as one incarnation. He told of his years as a renowned professor at Harvard University as another. And then he became part of the 60s counterculture and a spiritual seeker for a time. And eventually he became a Hindu spiritual teacher. He explained in his article, which he had to dictate because he no longer could write, he said that he was now entering his next incarnation. This time, it was the life of a person with severe physical challenges. At each stage, he had to let go of what was in order to embrace what is. And whether we learn this from ancient religions or from evolutionary science, this is the simple and challenging secret to a life of joy and meaning and fulfillment. If we cannot die to what was, then we may remain alive in body, but we will be dead in spirit. A person who is single and then gets married has to die to being single in order to fully live into this new stage of life. The person who becomes a parent has to let his or her expectations of who their child is supposed to be die, so that they can embrace who their child really is. If you've ever seen the parents who have just held on, my son was supposed to be this way and supposed to be that way, and then life is just a battle. And our job as parents is to help these children to be who they are and fully come alive, whoever they are. But that requires the death of some preconceived ideas so that a new life can be born. The person who's divorced must face the death of that part of their life so that they can embrace and live into their life now. If we cannot learn to let what is dead be dead and let something new arise, then we become like the walking dead ourselves. What is it in nature that clings to life and does not understand its need to die? Cancer. Healthy skin cells die and are replaced by new skin cells. Cancer cells just keep living. The poet Goethe writes, "Whoever has not experienced what it means to die and to become, to die and to be recreated in dying, is but a sorry vagrant on this dark earth of ours." In other words, it is death that creates life. This is the evolutionary version of the Easter story. Maybe its true meaning from the beginning. Out of death of the old, the new arises, says the theologian Paul Tillich. But let's face it, it's one thing to talk about the death of stars and to talk about the death of cells, but it's a whole nother thing to talk about the death of the ego, or the death of a relationship, or the death of someone we love. We've all known adults who are like children, even though they've grown up in body and time. Some of them need therapy, but they refuse to go. They are afraid to lose their identity. They are afraid to die to what was, and so they remain stuck, unable to embrace what is. Addicts and alcoholics pour poison into their bodies to kill something that is wanting to die. A memory that haunts them, a trauma that torments, a grief that will not let them go. But the poison, instead of killing the problem, often kills the person. This is not a redemptive kind of death. Anyone who will forgo their family, their career, and the endless opportunities for love in this world just so that they can keep pouring more poison into their bodies is not living. But we know that even people with addictions can rise from these living deaths into new life. Just think of all the small deaths that occur in the course of a lifetime. Leaving home, reaching midlife, navigating the death of a loved one, the end of a career, the end of a relationship. I want to share with you a story I learned somewhat early in my life about death and rebirth. When I was in junior high school, there was a woman in my church who contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. As soon as the diagnosis was confirmed, her husband of 13 years took off. He literally ran away. I'll never forget the sorrow on the woman's face as members of our church took turns pushing her in a wheelchair into the service every Sunday. The sorrow we all felt was so much bigger than the unfortunate and impending death of this once beautiful and vibrant woman. The ghost of her husband's failure to live up to their covenant of marriage was always circling around her, or at least around in the minds of all of us who saw her. And as sad as it all was, there was always the question in the back of everyone else's mind saying, could I do it? Would I be strong enough to put my life on hold, to watch and assist the person I love die a slow and debilitating death? And I suspect that everyone's internal, yes, of course I would, was always tinged with just a little self-doubt and self-recrimination. It was as if his action held up before us the possibility of our own failure. Then about 8 months or a year later, her husband returned. He returned to face his deeply disappointed and dying, but gracious and merciful wife. And he returned to face the inevitable judgments and ultimate embrace of his church community. Even at 13, I remember that along with his return came a feeling as if an ominous cloud had been lifted from our entire church. Not only did his wife have her husband back, but we all could take a sigh of relief, imagining that the potential hero within us all was still a possibility. And an even bigger relief to know that even if we did the unthinkable, our community would not banish or scorn us, but would welcome us back, like the prodigal son. He was lost, and now he's found. He was dead, and he's come back to life. How did he do it? This man, this husband? Was it prayer? Was it friends? Was it therapy? Or a combination of all three? I never found out. But somehow, at some point, he realized that he could not keep running from what is and try to hold on to some idea of what was his life, like a cancer that does not know when it's time to die. But no matter what, his wife was going to die, and he was going to live, but the life that he was living was worse than death. What saves us is our ability to die and be reborn over and over again in this life. And we don't have to take it on faith. We just have to remember that this is truly a matter of life and death.